Hi, this is Richard Idland, the National Policy Director with Business for America. We're a national nonpartisan nonprofit organization working in Pennsylvania and across the country to support a healthy democracy. And today we're really happy to have with us Acting Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Leigh Chapman. And Secretary Chapman is going to participate in discussion about steps that the state of Pennsylvania is taking to ensure there's a safe, fair, accurate, accessible election. We had a number of organizations that helped to co-host this and promote this event today. And I wanted to thank them, in particular, the Greater Lehigh Valley Chamber of Commerce, the Chamber of Commerce for Greater Philadelphia, the Pocono Chamber of Commerce, the Committee of 70 based in Philadelphia, and the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia. One of our primary partners in this venture, in our work in Pennsylvania, is the West Philadelphia Corridor Collaborative. And Jabari Jones is here with us this afternoon. And Jabari, if you just say a little bit before we get going with Secretary Chapman about the work that we're doing together in Pennsylvania and the Get Back to Business Pennsylvania effort.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, Richard. I'm glad to be here with all of you, and thank you so much for coming and participating in the discussion, as well as our promotional partners. Both Business for America and the West Philly Corridor Collaborative have been collaborating on this initiative called the Getting Back to Business PA program, which the purpose of that program has been to engage and catalyze the voices of businesses across the state in a nonpartisan manner to fight for and advocate for common sense reforms, create some dialogues around some of the issues in the democracy spaces, as well as push on legislators to an extent on focusing on some of the top issues that are affecting both businesses and residents across the state. So we're glad to bring this dialogue to all of you, and hope everybody enjoys the program. Pitch it back to you, Richard.
Great, Jabari, thank you. I also wanted to give a shout out and expression of thanks to the William Penn Foundation and the Heinz Endowments that have been instrumental in supporting our work in Pennsylvania. So just by way of context here, Business for America and the West Philadelphia Corridor Collaborative have been involved in election-related issues on a nonpartisan basis, beginning in 2019 in Pennsylvania. And we were supporters of AB 77, which you all might recall was a comprehensive initiative passed in the legislature on a bipartisan basis to modernize the election infrastructure and administrative process by which the Commonwealth runs its elections. And that was a really seminal piece of legislation passed in 2019. And that enabled a number of important initiatives to take place, including the adoption of vote by mail. And since the 2020 election, as I'm sure you're all aware of, there have been repeated assertions and claims that the vote in the Commonwealth needs further improvement, and that some of the systems need further upgrading, and some have even challenged the overall integrity of the election system. So what we wanted to do today was have Acting Secretary Chapman give us an understanding and some education on how the process actually works and what her office is doing. So by way of quick introduction, Leigh Chapman was appointed by Governor Wolf to be the Acting Secretary of the Commonwealth on January 8th of 2022 to lead the Department of State. And prior to assuming that position, Ms. Chapman was the Executive Director of Deliver My Vote, and had also spent a number of years working on voting rights issues with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, where we first had an opportunity to work with her. in 2015 to from 2015 to 2017, Ms. Chapman was the policy director for the Department of State. So, Leigh, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Richard. I appreciate it. And it's so wonderful to be on this call with Business for America. As you mentioned, I first met you and Sarah Bonk back when I worked at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And we had such a wonderful working relationship. And it was great to see from my vantage point at that time, everything you were doing to support election officials when it came to making sure that voters were safe during the 2020 election, during the COVID-19 pandemic with PPE. And it's also wonderful now that I'm sitting in this seat as acting secretary to really see that impact on Pennsylvania and to hear my staff and counties talk so highly about Business for America and everything that you did to support Pennsylvania. So thank you for inviting me here today, and I look forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you, thank you. Well, why don't we start with an explanation of what the Department of State is responsible for, particularly concerning elections, and the reason that businesses are so concerned about election integrity and election security is largely because their employees are looking to them to provide information. So our sense, Ms. Chapman, is that the more that companies and business leaders understand how the election system works, what your department is responsible for, they will become more effective communicators and messengers to their employees.
Sure. So, I am an appointed Secretary of State. So just looking nationally, there's only 4 appointed Secretaries of State that are also Chief Election Officers. So my department works a little bit differently than those that are elected to the position. So I think that's one thing that's very important to note. Also, I not only oversee elections, but I oversee professional licensure in the state. We license over 90,000 professional licensees, everyone from cosmetologists to barbers to funeral directors to real estate appraisers. It runs the gamut. I oversee corporate registration, charitable registration, campaign and finance, and lobbying disclosure, and also the State Athletic Commission. So that's mixed martial arts and professional boxing. So I actually do quite a lot, and elections is actually the smallest piece of my portfolio when it comes to staff, but it definitely is the most high profile work that we do here at the Department of State. So as an appointed Secretary of State, my job is really to oversee the administration of elections in the Commonwealth, meaning, I'm responsible for the statewide election management and voter registration system here in Pennsylvania. I also provide guidance to counties and directives when it comes to how they implement election law, if there's changes due to litigation, also when it comes to voting technology and machines. So I certify as well as the United States Election Assistance Commission. We both certify election machines and provide that information to counties. But in Pennsylvania, there's 67 different counties. So elections are run at the local level, and they're often run in different ways. But my role as Secretary of State is really to provide uniformity when it comes to guidance and support counties in the administration of elections.
Right. And just to become a little bit more specific on the relationship between the department and the counties, as you said, the counties make their own decisions about the particulars of how the day of the election is being run. But say more about the guidance that you're offering and what they're required to do because the state has mandated that.
Sure. So, it varies, right? So I'll give you Act 77 as an example. Act 77 was the largest reform that we've seen in Pennsylvania when it comes to our elections in over 80 years. And it brought mail-in voting to Pennsylvania. So, a lot of states like Washington State, Colorado, even California had no excuse mail-in voting for many years, but it wasn't until that law passed in 2019 that brought it to Pennsylvania. And we've seen over 5.3 million voters take advantage of mail-in voting in Pennsylvania. So it's widely popular. But when it comes to implementation of the act, there's certain things that are required by law, right? So mail-in voting is the law of the land. Every county must provide voters with an opportunity to register to vote by mail, to cast their ballot. But when it comes to certain discretionary things like mail-in drop boxes, how many drop boxes a county wants, the location of drop boxes, that's something that is up to the county to decide. But what we do as far as guidance is we tell counties, okay, these are the best practices for the type of drop boxes you should use, right? So there's various parts within a law that counties can have discretion on, and it's our role as a department to provide as much clear guidance as we can. And a lot of times the counties ask for it. They say, you know, we don't know what to do. What do you recommend? Another way we do that is also by just having office hours. So every other week, my department meets with all 67 county election directors, and we just have an open forum, somewhat similar to what we're doing now, where we have a conversation about if there's a new law or a new court decision or anything we can do to support them when it comes to administering elections. So we have biweekly office hours with election directors. And as you also know, in Pennsylvania, there's county commissioners who are also involved in elections, and we have monthly meetings with them as well.
Great. Leigh, you had mentioned Act 77, which updated the system, hadn't been updated in more than 80 years. Mm-hmm. And it made a number of improvements, but some suggest maybe it didn't go far enough. So what other changes might you like to see, that Act 77 passed on a bipartisan basis did not move forward?
And that's a really good point. Act 77 was passed on a bipartisan basis, and that's what brought mail-in voting to Pennsylvania. It also revamped our election system when it comes to technology. So under Act 77, counties were given over $90 million to purchase new voting equipment and machines. So those voting machines were also used for the first time during the 2020 election. It also moved up voter registration. So now voters have 15 more days to register to vote in Pennsylvania. But the main thing it did not do is it did not allow for pre-canvassing of ballots, which is why Pennsylvania is always one of the last states to actually deliver our unofficial returns. In 2020, we were all up watching election results. States like Florida were able to declare the winner immediately on election night because they have ample pre-canvassing, which allows local election officials to start opening mail-in ballots, separating them and processing them before election day. Here in Pennsylvania, that's not permitted until 7 a.m. on election day. So election officials aren't able to even start tabulating or even processing and opening them until 7 a.m. on election day, which is why it takes, days after for us to get our returns, which is frustrating because everybody wants to have results earlier, right? The voters want it, the candidates want it, media wants it. It's something that really is uniform, and all 67 of our counties want it, Republican and Democrat counties. Everybody wants this opportunity to pre-canvass. So that's something that we are currently continuing to advocate for with the legislature, is the ability for Pennsylvania to really fall in line with other states and move towards that gold standard of election administration and have that pre-canvassing time.
But that won't be the case for the November election, right?
No, it won't.
Right.
So unfortunately, the legislature has not passed pre-canvassing. One thing I will note is the legislature appropriated $45 million to counties in a bill, which is now, it's an act now. It's called Act 88. And Act 88 passed a few months ago. And so what that bill did was it restricted the counties and the state from receiving third-party funding. Mm-hmm. So as you all know, in 2020, Pennsylvania and our counties received millions of dollars from third-party groups to make sure that voters had a safe experience at the polling place. And with mail-in voting being new, with voting equipment being new, counties spent that money on equipment so they could process mail-in ballot materials. And I was actually just at Dauphin County, which is the county where Harrisburg is. I was visiting the county election director last week, and he showed me the equipment that he bought with that third-party funding. And he told me, you know, I would not have been able to make it through 2020 without this equipment that would allow me to sort mail-in ballots. You know, what takes 2 hours would take days before. So, you know, there has been a lot of controversy around this third-party funding, even though, you know, the department and the administration supported it, and a lot of counties. But the legislature decided to ban it. But in exchange, they gave $45 million to counties to administer elections. And that's going to be appropriated on an annual basis. So every year, counties will get that $45 million. Now, one thing that was really interesting that's included in that bill is when I said, you know, pre-canvassing doesn't start until 7 a.m. on election day. That was only if counties wanted to, right? They could start as early as 7 a.m., but some counties could start the next day. They could start that night. They weren't required to. So under Act 88, all counties, all 67 counties are now required to start pre-canvassing at 7 a.m. on election day. And they have to continuously count until they're finished counting. So they can't go to bed. They can't take breaks. And most counties are using that funding to hire additional staff who can then continue the count. So while the legislature did not give pre-canvassing, that was the effort to get results faster. But one thing that we can, you know, all use the help of everyone on this call is to help us manage expectations well in advance of election day. Because we don't have ample pre-canvassing, we can expect our unofficial results to be, you know, days or so later after the election.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. The Supreme Court, I know, in Pennsylvania recently ruled that Act 77 was in fact constitutional and the provisions would thus be adopted. But could you remind us what the controversy was about the alleged unconstitutionality of the legislation?
Sure. So the Commonwealth Court, which is the lower court in Pennsylvania, actually ruled Act 77 unconstitutional. And upon appeal, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled it constitutional. So it's constitutional. Mail-in voting is the law of the land, and that's something that we really need to continue to emphasize to the public, because there's a lot of confusion with, there's been a lot of disinformation and misinformation around mail-in voting because of not only the lawsuits, but just in general. You know, there's individuals who are opponents of mail-in voting, some people who prefer in-person voting, but the law in Pennsylvania is that if voters want to vote in person, they can. If voters want to vote by mail, they're permitted to, and you don't need to have an excuse to do that. So that's something I could really use the help of everybody on here, is to really continue to repost the trusted information that the Department of State has put out. We continually have information about mail-in voting, what the law is, how to request a mail-in ballot on our social media. So we're asking entities to repost and retweet it to maximize that, because, you know, unfortunately, in the time that we are now, misinformation and disinformation is really proliferating. And we had an incident actually right before the Supreme Court decision where there was a tweet that went viral that said that mail-in voting was illegal in Pennsylvania, which was not the case. And we had to have a conversation with Twitter after we reported it to take that down. So they actually suspended that account. But we could use everyone's vigilance just to make sure that there isn't any confusion when it comes to voters about mail-in voting, because it is the law, it is in place. Voters can go right now to our website, which is vote.pa.gov, and request their mail-in ballot. And we've actually made it really easy because we made an enhancement to the voter registration form a couple of months ago, which is aimed to streamline the process now. So just like voters can do online, they can register to vote and they can request a mail-in ballot at the same time. We mirrored that with our paper form. So voters can now go on our website, download a paper voter registration mail application. They can register to vote and also request a mail-in ballot all at one time. It's a one-stop shop.
Great. You mentioned about mis and disinformation, and I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that. We're finding that it's certainly a problem across the country, and that businesses being trusted by their employees, by their customers, can often be a purveyor of accurate information. So as you think, Secretary Chapman, of the next coming weeks, what are some specific things that companies could do, in addition to encouraging their employees to vote? How else could they help amplify the information on your website?
Sure. So we're on Facebook, Twitter. We're not on Instagram or TikTok yet, but Facebook and Twitter, the Pennsylvania Department of State. And we are constantly posting information about the deadlines, right? So the first deadline coming up is the voter registration deadline, which is October 24th. The second deadline is the deadline to request a mail-in ballot, which is November 1st. So we have information on there. We also have toolkits that you can download that has information that's really easy to understand. We have it in English, we have it in Spanish, we also have it in traditional Chinese as well, that breaks down everything about how to register to vote, how to cast your ballot, and have it counted. So as you mentioned, the Department of State, we are a trusted source of information. We need to make sure that we're expanding our network and getting other trusted stakeholders like businesses to share accurate and truthful information, because that's the best way to, people are now using the word pre-bunk, right? We want to pre-bunk mis and disinformation as much as we can and get ahead of it as early as we can. And with the election, less than 60 days away, it's here. So if we can start right away and sharing that information earlier, then that will have the most help when it comes to voters.
Great, great. And you'll be happy to know that Business for America will be issuing a version of your toolkit that has a number of business-centric messages that encourage business leaders to pass relevant, accurate information on to their employees.
Oh, great. Thank you for doing that.
Yes. You had mentioned that vote by mail has really grown in popularity and acceptance. And are you finding that it appeals to one demographic over another? Are there certain segments of the public, the voting public in Pennsylvania, that are making greater use of vote by mail systems than others?
That's a really interesting question. And, I would love to do all the analysis. I'm a previous policy wonk when it comes to like race and gender. We actually added a non-binary option now on our mail ballot application. But it's hard to do that data analysis at the department because those aren't required fields, they're optional. Right. But, if you just look at trends and studies that others have implemented, as I mentioned, we had the highest turnout in 2020. We've seen 5.3 million people use mail-in voting. It's extremely popular. It's popular in urban areas, rural areas, not only amongst older voters, which I think a lot of people would think, but also younger voters. So there's really diverse acceptance from it. One thing that I would say is, we have a campaign called the Ready to Vote campaign here at the Department of State, and it's really aimed at meeting voters where they are. So we are about to launch a multimedia campaign that includes text messages, radio ads. We have ads on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. I mean, we are doing everything we can to reach all voters in Pennsylvania, because it's about making sure that every single voter, regardless of political party or any affiliation, that they have the information, if they choose to vote by mail. If not, they have the information to find their polling place and how to vote in person.
Okay. There's a question which says, how are mail-in voters identified to be sure that they are legitimately registered and able to vote?
Sure. So, of course, in order to receive a mail-in ballot, you have to be registered to vote first. And, the county checks eligibility, right? So in order to be registered, you have to be 18 years old. You have to be a resident of Pennsylvania for 30 days. And for mail-in voting under Act 77, this is something that a lot of people don't realize. There is a voter ID requirement for mail-in voting in Pennsylvania. So for every mail-in voting request, you have to submit a voter ID. So those are some ways that eligibility is verified.
Okay. Could you say more about the voter ID requirements? I know that's been a source of some controversy, with some feeling, it's too onerous, too restrictive, others feeling, we need to do more of that in order to ensure only eligible voters are participating. So what is the current status of voter ID in the state now?
Sure. So just to be clear, Pennsylvania does not have a strict voter ID law like some states like Texas, for instance, have. Back in I don't want to miss the year, but we did have a voter ID law. And it was actually when I was practicing as a junior voting rights attorney at another organization called the Advancement Project. But there was a voter ID law in Pennsylvania, and it was overturned by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court as unconstitutional in the Applewhite case. So that got rid of voter ID in Pennsylvania. So there is no strict voter ID requirement. If you are a first-time voter in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, however, you do have to show a form of ID when you go to the polls for the first time. So that doesn't have to be a photo ID, it doesn't have to be a driver's license or a non-driver's ID. You can use your utility bill or a bank statement, or there's other forms of ID, and those are all available on our website as far as the comprehensive list. That's only for first-time voters. But in addition, if you are a mail-in voter, you do have to show some type of form of ID to cast your mail ballot. So it's really important to know that under the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, the highest court in Pennsylvania, they have deemed voter ID to be unconstitutional. It violates the Constitution. One thing to note is there is a constitutional amendment that did pass a few months ago that it's gone through first passage, and it has a provision that would change the Pennsylvania Constitution to add voter ID. So the administration does not support strict voter ID laws, but there's a potential that it could be on the ballot in future subsequent elections.
Mm-hmm. And what is driving that push for stricter voter ID in your understanding?
I think it's just the political climate that we are in right now. And, as I mentioned, our administration, the Wolf administration, does not support voter ID. We don't, there's a lot of rhetoric about voter fraud that is non-existent. And as we all know, voter fraud is exceedingly rare. When we look at the 2020 elections, there were over 30 court cases that have debunked voter fraud and proved that it did not change the outcome of any election. So we really see it as a solution in search of a problem. And the administration does not support voter ID laws.
Right. Secretary Chapman, let me just stay with the voter fraud contention for a moment. There was much noise made in the state after the election that the results were fraudulent, and but I've not seen any evidence that there were actual cases of individual voters cited for a violation. So and I imagine your department would be involved in sussing that out. So what can you tell us about the status of voter security in Pennsylvania as a result of the 2020 election?
Yeah, voters can be confident that we have secure elections in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. As I mentioned before, there really has been no evidence of widespread voter fraud that would change the outcome of the election. Yes, there is very few instances where voter fraud does happen in rare circumstances, but in the case when it happens, it's caught by county election officials and it's referred to the proper prosecution and officials, and it's prosecuted. So, voters can feel confident that when we look at 2020 election results in Pennsylvania, they were litigated in federal courts, they were litigated in state courts. There were over 30 cases, and all of those cases validated that the 2020 election was secure and that there were no issues when it comes to fraudulent votes. So, I think it's important that as part of, being a truth teller and being someone who can share trusted information, that people are also sharing those hard facts about the status of our elections and the security of our elections here in the Commonwealth.
Okay, good. Good. Let me move to a few questions. And by the way, folks, if you have a question, use the Q&A function, and I will make sure to get to it. As you know, many Pennsylvania businesses have set up programs to encourage their employees to vote. Some are part of the national Time to Vote effort led by Patagonia and PayPal and Levi's. And companies are doing a variety of things. But I know that you have some particular needs that maybe businesses can help provide, including poll workers. So can you give us the short to moderate list of things that businesses can help with?
Sure. So poll worker recruitment is always at the front of our minds. Even before the COVID pandemic, there was always an issue with, making sure that we had a strong robust pipeline of poll workers here in Pennsylvania. When I worked here before in 2015, that was something that county election officials were saying that they needed more support on. And so that definitely has been exacerbated by, the COVID-19 pandemic. Just helping us recruit poll workers. Poll workers are your neighbors, they're your friends, or they're your family members, and they're really the frontline workers of our democracy. And so we have a website, vote.pa.gov/get-involved, and we are pushing that out to get as many people as we can to sign up for poll workers. We actually had a National Poll Worker Recruitment Day last month. And on that one day, we recruited over 1,000 poll workers for Pennsylvania. But, we need more, because if you actually there's 9,000 polling places in the Commonwealth, and there's at least 5 poll workers if you're, if that's the minimum number of poll workers. So we're looking at 45,000 poll workers to make sure the entire state is staffed up for the election. So there's always a need. In particular, in certain counties like Philadelphia and Lehigh and Berks County, there's a need to have poll workers that are multilingual, so who speak Spanish in all those 3 counties. And in Philadelphia in particular, there's a need for poll workers who are proficient in Chinese. And that's new. This will be the first election where Chinese is a requirement in Philadelphia. So that was made by the Voting Rights Act. It was a new determination looking at growing numbers and changing demographics. So if you have anyone who can help in that area, that's something that's definitely needed. We touched on the second need that I mentioned earlier in our conversation, Richard, which is just helping us share trusted sources of information. That's critically important. And, we actually have a hotline, and it's 1-877-VOTES-PA. And at any time, anyone has a question about, how to register or how to request their mail-in ballot, or, my mail-in ballot didn't show up on time. What do I do now? You can call our hotline at 1-877-VOTES-PA, and we have people who can answer questions. So, promoting that number, promoting ways that voters can get help is something that, we could definitely use assistance with as well.
Okay, good. Secretary Chapman, there's a clarifying question here about voter ID. And it said, you said there is voter ID for mail-in voting, but when you turn in your ballot to the drop box or the county election office or mail it, no voter ID is required. That's a question. Did you mean when you fill in your application, you must provide information?
Yes, I meant when you fill in your application. When you fill in your when you apply for a mail-in ballot, not when you're returning it.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Let me go back to this issue about poll workers for a moment. And, given the difficult conditions that a number of election officials have faced since 2020, threats of violence, intimidation, harassment, are you finding that election workers or poll workers have become more difficult to find because they are concerned about their safety? Is that part of the issue?
You know, that's part of the issue. My staff and I were actually talking about this because we keep track every time there's a departure when it comes to county election directors. And since 2020, we've had 50 departures for election directors. 50 election directors have left their jobs. Now, I was looking at the list.
And I'm sorry, that's 50 within the counties?
Yes, 50 elections. So
of 77 counties.
67 counties.
67 counties, sorry. Mm-hmm.
So that's a significant turnover when you're talking about election directors. You know, a lot of people who have these jobs will keep it for, 20 plus years or until they retire. And so we've seen turnover because of some planned retirements. We've seen it, because of stress on the job. And yes, election threats have contributed to that turnover. So it's something that, we are concerned about, and we are doing everything we can to support new county election directors, because for many of them, this is the first election that they've administered, right? So we are having those biweekly office hours. We are having those meetings with county commissioners just to make sure that they understand how Pennsylvania elections are run and operated, and that they have the support that they need to get up to speed, and, ensure that they have adequate help. One thing I wanted to mention is some counties may have had more than one leave, or some have left to go to other counties in Pennsylvania, okay. But the aggregate number is 50 that have departed.
Okay. And is the state legislature tracking this, and are they seeking to increase penalties against, for those making threats to election workers? Is there some effort underway to protect the infrastructure?
That's a really good question. I was actually on a fireside chat with the Secretary of State of New Jersey and Maine the other day, and the Maine Secretary of State did mention that they have legislation that passed to increase penalties when it comes to election threats. That's not something that has come up in Pennsylvania yet. So I think there's work that the legislature could do. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the Department of State, we're doing everything we can to also provide training and resources to counties. So we have strong partnerships with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, with the FBI, right? So we have had a few tabletop exercises with all of the counties, so they know who to contact, who to report threats to. So we are keeping track of it at the Department of State and providing resources that we can for counties to address it if it happens.
Okay, great. Let me turn to a different potential threat, which is what happens if a county commissioner refuses to certify that county's election count in November. What recourse does the Department of State have in a situation like that?
So we had a similar situation in the primary. As you all know, in the primary election, there was a court decision that came down, which basically told counties that if there are ballots that come in the mail or are received by a county, and the voter fails to put a date on it, or if a voter fails to put a date at all, or put the wrong date, a lot of voters actually put their birthday as opposed to the actual day that they're mailing in their ballot, then that ballot should still be counted because the date's immaterial. Counties still have a way to verify when that ballot is received. Some counties stamp them, but counties log when that ballot is received. So even if there isn't a date, they still can determine that that ballot was timely received. So right in the middle of the primary, we received this court case saying count ballots without dates or wrongly dated ballots. We issued guidance to the counties like we do whenever there's a new court decision on what to do when it comes to that. But we had 3 counties who decided not to certify the vote totals with those undated ballots. So, the only recourse we had at that time was to bring a lawsuit. So that's something that is a similar tool to our disposal if that were to occur. But, it's really our expectation that counties follow the law. They're required to certify the vote. They're required to certify the vote in accordance to not only the statute, but in accordance to legal court precedent. And it's our expectation that counties will follow the law. And I've reiterated this, to the counties in person as well. So, we are continuing to issue guidance if there's any changes in the law before the November election or during certification. We will provide that guidance, but it's our expectation they will follow the law.
Okay, thank you. And again, folks, if you have a question, just put it into the Q&A and I'll get to it. Secretary Chapman, let me turn to a question about who's voting and how to increase turnout. And I know that the department has a program called All in Democracy Challenge, which I understand is working with at least 70 colleges and universities across the state to encourage participation by young people and encourage 18-year-olds to get registered. So could you describe how that program works, and maybe also how a business might partner in some fashion with a college or university in their community?
Sure. So, one thing to note is, although we've had the highest participation in the 2020 election, there's still a lot more work to be done. When we look at high participation rates, it's around 60 to 70%, but there's still more that we need to do to get to that fuller picture of, or at least to get closer to that 100% voter participation. And in Pennsylvania, there's actually 1.7 million voters who are eligible to vote who are still unregistered. So at the Department of State, we're really seeing, we're trying to think about a comprehensive way to meet voters where they are and to provide opportunities for voters to register to vote. We are working with colleges in the All in Democracy Challenge. As you mentioned, there's 74 public and private campuses that are part of that program. We provide materials and toolkits to increase student engagement, and we give awards based on highest campus turnout and most improved turnout and highest student voter registration. We have a very similar program in the high schools, and it's actually called the Governor's Civic Engagement Award. And we give out awards for, we have a gold award, a bronze award, a silver award based on the percentage of voter registration in high schools. So, one way to participate is it's really important to uplift the great work that these universities are doing, helping students with voter registration drives, maybe joining events with them. That would be great, just to encourage that voter registration. In addition, just last week, the Governor Wolf actually issued an executive order on voter registration. And that executive order added 7 additional state agencies that are now required to provide voter registration forms as the public interacts with them. So that includes the Department of State. So my department, we are initially under the National Voter Registration Act, weren't required to provide voter registration forms. But now as business customers are coming in to file their paperwork, we're now providing voter registration forms as people are interacting with us to renew their licenses or professional licenses. We're providing that. They also added the parks, so the 121 state parks to that list. Education, Department of Education, so public libraries are now required to provide those. Department of Corrections, which is really important because in Pennsylvania, we don't have some of these antiquated felony disenfranchisement laws like other states. And so individuals can register to vote when they have served their time and when they're released from incarceration. So we're working with the Bureau of Corrections to have voter registration forms and reentry packets. So there's a lot of work to be done, and it's really important just that we're thinking about this in a comprehensive way to meet voters, as they're conducting their daily activities and their daily business. So we're really proud of that executive order. And thank you. That was when I had to reschedule this event for the first time because that was our executive order press conference.
Good.
So thank you for your patience. But
we thought it was a very legitimate reason. So.
Yes. So, we're just doing everything we can to make sure voters are on the rolls because that's the first step to increasing participation.
Right. Okay. Good. Good. Have just a few more questions here, and then we'll let you go. So we have a question about drop boxes, and they've been very popular in Philadelphia and well utilized. So the question is, how many counties are now using drop boxes? And essentially, what more can the Department of State do to encourage the use of drop boxes in other counties across the state? And, are there any barriers to the use of drop boxes in certain parts of the state?
That's a really good question. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I could definitely follow up with the number of counties that are using drop boxes. But we probably won't have a final list for a few more weeks because, counties are now making decisions on if they're going to have drop boxes, how many drop boxes. And as I mentioned before, it's a county level decision. So it's really important that citizens are engaged with their local boards of elections as they're having public meetings, as they're discussing, whether or not to have drop boxes to participate in those meetings. And if you think they're a benefit to, talk about that. Unfortunately, drop boxes have come under scrutiny since 2020 when they came to Pennsylvania. But one thing I can underscore is that they're safe and they're secure. And in Pennsylvania, the law is individuals return their own ballots unless you have a disability, then you can declare a designated agent. We have a special designated agent form for someone to return that ballot for you. So, we support drop boxes. I think it's important for us, and we educate voters to look up drop box locations. We definitely communicate that as a way and an option for voters to return their ballots. But as I mentioned before, we have guidance on it, but it's really a county by county decision. So, we provide links to all the locations on our website as soon as we get those drop box locations.
Okay, good. A different question. As part of my voter outreach activities, I purchased and downloaded the full voter export file, I think, of September 1st. I noticed that there are thousands of voters across the state with a date of birth or registration date as of 01/01/1800. This is apparently across many counties, and the question is, who's responsible for checking and cleaning the data to whom I can report these errors to?
Well, thank you for flagging that. Counties conduct regular list maintenance of the voter rolls, so they remove voters who haven't voted in a certain number of federal elections, voters who are deceased, what have you. But I can definitely take a look at that and follow up if I can get that person's information.
Yes, I will connect you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good. Okay. All right, the questions keep coming here. I have a different question. I've just learned that the Department of State will be arguing before the PA Supreme Court this week in the case of the County of Fulton versus Secretary of the Commonwealth, which is a challenge to a directive the Secretary of State issued prohibiting counties to bring in third-party consultants to inspect voting devices, and the Secretary's subsequent decertification of 2 Fulton County voting machines in July of 21. Could you tell us a bit about this appeal?
I wish I really could, but under advice of counsel, I'm not able, or I'm not permitted to discuss active litigation. Right. Okay. But what I will tell you is, all of our arguments are in those pleadings. So if you're interested in the state's position, you can take a look at those pleadings in that case and get more information that way. But,
okay.
That's my lawyers would not be happy if I went into detail about it.
Good. Okay, good. Secretary Chapman, I wanted to ask you about the Electoral Count Reform Act. And as it makes its way through the U.S. Congress, there's been lots of discussion about its impact on the operations of state election operations. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about the ECRA, the adequacy, how it might impact what happens in the Commonwealth, and anything you'd like to offer about that proposal, now under consideration in the Senate.
That's a good question. There on occasion, we do take positions on federal legislation. At this point, we have not taken a formal position on that particular piece of legislation, but, in general, the Wolf administration supports legislation that would make sure that elections are, secure, accessible, and that every vote is counted, and that, the Secretary of State's certification is upheld, and that is something that is continued out. So we don't have a position on that particular piece of legislation as of yet, but I'm really interested to see what happens with it as we move closer to 2024.
Right, good. And just for the listeners, Business for America is circulating a business sign-on letter that you can find at our website at bfa.us that calls for Congress to approve the pending legislation. And things seem to be moving in the right direction. There are now 10 Republican senators who expressed support. So looks like it has a decent chance of making its way through Congress. Secretary Chapman, let me just ask one final question here, and thanks for your time with us. What would in your estimation, be the principal reason why businesses should care about a safe, accurate, and reliable election system? What is really the bottom line here as far as the private sector is concerned?
Mm-hmm. I think it's the more people who are active participants in our democracy, the healthier our democracy is, right? So, it's really important to encourage that your employees participate in every single election, not just, the federal ones or the ones that happen for president every 4 years, but really take an active, role in promoting election participation. And it's really important that people understand what's at stake in the election, regardless of political party, just that, you're electing people that have a say in, your local and state and federal roles. And, that also impacts the way your business functions and the health of your business who's elected into these offices. So, in order for us to have a representative democracy, we need to have diverse walks of people participate in our elections, right? And so that's why businesses should be interested in supporting expansion of voting rights in elections, and also opposing barriers to restrict voting access. I think it's important. The businesses are a very, very powerful voice to also oppose some of these restrictions that we're seeing around the country when it comes to voting, because we need to have more participation to have a healthy democracy.
Right. Well said. That's exactly the way we feel about it. Thank you so much for your time today, Secretary Chapman. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to working with you and your team in the coming weeks.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard.
Good. Thank you all for joining us today. And we'll be back in touch and look forward to working with you all. Thank you.